Saving and managing data in React is obviously a core skill that we need to learn. There are many ways of doing that. This tutorial is focused on using hooks or hook functions to manage the React state. In this tutorial, we're going to cover the useState and useReducer function, both hook functions in React. We're going to be utilizing a very simple example to do that, starting from very basic and then moving up to this final outcome, whereby we'll keep refactoring our code. So we want to be able to add items to our shopping cart and then remove the items. Of course, we need to think about removing different items from the cart because we're removing and adding different items into our shopping cart. So that's something we need to think about. Obviously, there's other things we want to be able to do. For example, if we add something here, we don't want them to be able to remove the items from our total cost if we don't actually add the item, and so on. So there's a few things that we need to think about here. This is a very good example for us to practice utilizing. I've gone ahead and created a new folder for this project. And in addition to that, just make sure that you have Node.js installed so we can use the npx command. So I've opened up Visual Studio Code and I've created a new project folder like I've already said. I've made a file here called commands.txt. So any commands that I use, I'll put it into this commands text file so that you can have a look and utilize in your project. So go ahead and run the command to set out or start your application. So here we're just creating a new React app and we're going to call the application store. So that's what this command is all about. And then once you've done, you need to just cd into the store folder. So that changes the directory. And then last of all, just test this by typing in npm start, and that should be the start of the project. So that's going to open up in your browser. So we're now presented with the default React screen that just tells us or lets us know that the app is working okay. And now we can start developing further. There is just a little bit of setup here for this application, and I will quickly run through this and just copy and paste some code in and just to quickly explain and give you an overview of what's happening here. And then as we go through actually managing the React state, I'll type in line by line and I'll give you a much deeper view of what's going on. So let's just go over the setup here for this application. We're going to need inside the src folder, we're going to need a new folder. So components, and then inside of here we're going to create another folder for our store. So these folders are going to hold our components that we're going to display on the screen. So inside of store, I think we're only going to build one component called products. That's a JS file. So products. So that's going to display all the products. Okay, so now we've got that in place, let's go over to, we're not going to need this CSS page here. So we remove that. We will need a CSS page actually for products. So let's build that. And so in our app here, what we're going to do, we're just going to remove all this. So we don't need that for now. And then the index page is going to be the same. So the general flow here, if you're not familiar with React, this is our entry point, our index page in the public. That's going to run the index page here. And this is basically what you're seeing on the page, or the structure or the elements that you see inside of the page on the screen. So you can see this is a reference to app. We're bringing in the app component and then we're displaying it right there. So that's how we're displaying whatever's inside of this app file here. Now what we're going to do in this app file, just to get this working, is that we're just going to make a reference to our products component. So what we're doing here, you can see that we're bringing React as per normal. Now remember, this app here is on the root src folder. So I use dot. So dot here refers to this folder, the src folder. And then we want to go into the components folder, the store folder, and then open up or access the products.js file. So we bring that in as products. We refer to it as products, and you can see in the middle here, we then just place it onto the screen. So that's why when we go to the browser and open up this app, you're going to see whatever's inside of the products page, or should I say component. So there's a little bit of a chain here, index.js, app.js, and then opening up the products.js file. So let's go into the products.js file. We're going to need two things. So we import React as per normal, and then we've got the product CSS page, which we're utilizing in a short while. So now what we need to do is we just need to export default. So we want to export this data, make it available. So we do that. So we're going to call this products, and then inside of here we're going to need a return. So we're bringing the return, and then inside of this return is obviously we want to return some data onto the screen. So that's going to be a mixture of HTML and JavaScript potentially. So what we have here is a very simple setup. We've just got a container here where we're going to place all of our items in as we go through this tutorial. And inside of here, we're going to record total items that's been saved to our checkout or our basket, sorry. And then we've got the total cost of all the items that we've selected. And then we've got some products. So we just got an element here to hold the products. And we're going to have two buttons, an add and remove button. And then inside of there, we're going to add some products. So we'll go ahead and add the area label and also the role. That's going to be required, otherwise you'll receive an error or a warning. So we've got that in place. So you can see what now we've produced. Let's go into the browser again. And this is what we have. So a very simple interface, nothing fancy for this tutorial. This is obviously concentrating on state management. So we have the ability to potentially now add and remove items. Obviously, we're going to attach a cost to those. So let's just go back into this code. Let's just do one final thing. Let's just go into the CSS here, and let's just align this so we can better see this on the page. So again, I'm just going to copy this in. So we're going to have a background of EEE, so just a little gray background. Our container is going to have a padding at the top. It's going to have a maximum width or width of 600 pixels. And we're going to set margin 0 auto to display it in the middle of the page. Now we're using font weight here because that's going to actually change the sock icon that you see to change the size. And then we text align right. So we're going to align the cost and the items on the right. Font size 30 for the that text. And for the products, we're going to align them on the left-hand side. And span here, it says font size 120. So the icon, the sock icon, is in the inside the span. So we're just resizing that. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like now. And there we go. So just for those who may have a problem at this point, so in the index.js file, this is the end code here, if you want to copy that. The app.js file, this is what we're looking at right here. So remember, the index page here is importing the app, and the app then is essentially importing the products from the products here. And then we've been doing our work inside of the products.js file. If you do have any problems, just check the syntax, semicolons and so on. It's likely to be a syntax problem at this point. If you are still having problems after that, the code is in the description. So go ahead and download the code for this. You will find in the code that I've actually named this stage 1, stage 2, etc. So you can have a look at the code at different stages. If you have a look at the project folder here, it says stage 1 zip. So all the files that you see right here are inside of this stage 1. Now to the main event, so state management. So here we're discussing, or we're developing, the idea of keeping track of the application's data. So when we think of state management, we think of saving data, loading data, changing data within the React application so we can use it within our application. Take, for example, our application. We're going to go through the process of managing the data, because here, for example, we're going to add some socks. And this is going to change the total of items that we've selected to buy. And then, of course, the socks has an associated cost. So we're going to need to update the cost. Now, we want this data to persist while we're using the application. So that means that we're going to need to store this data here, the quantity and the cost, in a state. So we're going to store this data in memory, or we can just say in the React application, so that then the React application can then react to it if we then perform another action. So for example, if we remove the socks, then of course we want to remove the data or change the data in the state so that we can then change the total items and the total cost. So there are a number of different ways of us managing and tracking state management. Here we can utilize class-based state management. There are third-party libraries, and in this tutorial we're going to be utilizing hooks. So I don't want to go the whole way and say this is a preferred way of working, utilizing hooks, but it is encouraged by the official React documentation. So the state then. So when I talk about the state, here we're just discussing, or in general terms, we're saying data that is stored, maybe in the React application, that we can utilize by the application to perform different actions. So I gave you the example of socks, saving stocks, saving the costs of socks, and then obviously updating the sock data and removing the data as and when we need to, based upon the interactions we have with our application. So if you're not familiar with hooks, we don't want to go into the ins and outs of the hooks, but in general terms, hooks are functions. So here we're just talking about functions. So hooks are essentially, if we read into this, hooks into the React state. So we're going to use a hook to hook into the React state where data is stored, and also the lifecycle features, so that we can manage and monitor and update the state. So there's a few different commands that we can use, or a few different hooks that we can utilize to access and update our state in React. So let's get coding. So we have this static hard-coded data at the moment. Let's now change this into dynamic values utilizing hooks and the React state. Okay, so I apologize. I'm not trying to delay the code here, just so we got a clear overview of what we're doing here, and apologize if you already know this type of information. So hooks then. So we're going to import a hook. So I said that React is a function that we can utilize. So hooks are functions that let you run actions as part of the React lifecycle, for example. So hooks can be triggered by other actions and then change the state, the data. So generally React hooks start with use. So useState, useContext, and useReducer. So we're going to be utilizing these within our application to learn a little bit more about how to manage state with hooks. So these hooks aren't something that we write, so let's go over and import them into our project. So that's what we're going to do first. So we're going to just extend our first piece of code up here. So we're in the products file here. So we're going to need to utilize the useState first. So let's go ahead and put this into our project first. So here I'll just import React and also useState. So now we have the useState available within our project. Let's go ahead and use this. So what we're doing here is we're using useState to essentially capture the data that's stored in state. So imagine we have 10 apples stored here in state. We're going to need to perform some action on these 10 apples. So we want to maybe set the data. So we might want to, for example, change the data inside of this state where there's 10 apples. And in addition to that, we might want to read the 10 apples and then display it on the page. So this is what we're going to use cart for. So useState is a function. So this is a function here that takes the initial state data as an argument and then returns it as an array with two items, in this case cart and setCart. So you can obviously change the names of these here, but essentially they're performing two actions here. Here we can actually define and add items to the state, and here we can read data and then return it somewhere on our page. Probably to define that more in technical terms, the first item here is a variable containing the state. So this is going to contain all the data from the state, which we can then use on the page here. So the second item here, this here is a function that will update the state. Okay, that's probably a better definition of what these two items are. So if we did have data in this state, we could collect it in the cart here and now display it on the page. So how you might do that is that you would refer to it, in this case cart, and then, for example, apples. And that would display the amount of apples that we're storing in the state. Of course, we're not storing apples. So let's just put quantity. So we don't actually have any data yet to extract out and display, but that's how we're going to utilize the state to actually display it on our page. So let's just see this in action, a very basic example here. Let's just change this to a 0 here. So we're going to store 0, and let's go ahead and just change cart to quantity to just cart. So we're going to read everything inside of his state. Obviously we just got the 0 here, and then we're going to put that into cart and then just display it on the screen. So let's go ahead and do that. So you can now see I've got the 0 again. So let's just change that just to make sure that it is working. So let's just change that, for example, to the number 1. We'll go back and you can see it's been updated automatically. In this scenario, we want to store 2 items, don't we? We want to store information about the total items that we have placed into this cart, and then also we want to store the total cost. So let's go back into our project here, and now we're going to create a new useState for the actual total. So let's go ahead and refer to total. So this is going to be utilized to actually extract the data and to view it or to store the data and to view it on our page. So we utilize that for that. And then obviously we can use the word set total. And that's going to be then utilized to actually store more data in the state. So that's obviously going to equal useState. And in this case, we just prepare that ready. Okay, so now what we can also do is if we now go into the total cost here, we can obviously change this and just change this to total, because that's what's going to store the actual total figure. So now we're ready to actually put some items into our state. So let's go ahead now and let's just add a new item. So we're going to build a function here. And this function is going to be called add. So we're going to add some items to our state. Obviously, when we press this button add here, we want to add the item to the state to recognize that we've now added something to our cart. And we want to then store the data about the item that we've added to the cart. So this is why we're going to set the array in the set cart, so we can store the items, or an array of all the items that we've selected to go into the cart. So function add, and then we go ahead and we now need to set the cart, because remember, in order to get data inside of a state, we need to use set cart. So we use set cart, and then we just define what we want to add inside. So we're going to add in this case, it's going to be socks. So we're going to add these socks here to our state. And then we also want to set a cost of these socks. So these socks are going to cost, so let's set total. So remember, we're setting the cart with the item socks, and now we need to set the total. So set the total, and the socks are going to cost, I don't know, 5 or maybe 10. They're going to be pretty expensive socks. So I'm using pounds. So 10, it's going to be £10. Okay, so we're not using this function yet. It's kind of highlighted out a little bit. So that's going to be our function to set the socks. Now what we need to do, of course, is go down into the button here, and we're just going to run the on click. And then we obviously want to run our function when we click the button. So when we click the button, it's going to run this function. So it's going to set the cart. It's going to add an item to this state here, this array, socks. And then in addition to that, we're then going to set the total. So we're going to change this state here to 10. So we can see that when we press the add button now, that's going to run the new function. It's going to update our state. And you can now see we're reading the state, and we've put some socks inside of our cart, and they cost, in this case, £10. So we don't want to display the name of the item. So what we can do is remember this is an array, so we put this array into cart. So what we can do is we can use functions, for example, length. So if I type in here length, I can then get the length of the array. So if there's one item in the array, it's going to return the number 1. So when I go back now and then add a new item, you now see it says 1 because there's one item in the array. Let's go ahead and now add something to this button here. So this is a remove button. So similar to the add button, we can use the on click again. And in this case, what we want to do is just reset. So let's reset this. So we're going to reset the state. So we're going to set cart. In this case, we want to just remove everything from the array. So we just set the blank array. And then of course, the next item, it was just an integer. So we're just storing an integer at the moment. So set total, and that's going to obviously represent 0. So let's go ahead and have a look, see what this looks like. So we add items. They get updated, so the state is updated, and then we remove an item, and you can see it then returns to 0. So because we're utilizing currency, we're going to need a float or, for example, fractional parts. So £10 50 pence or $100 and 50 cents and so on. So we're going to need to convert our total into a currency total that we can utilize for that type of format. So let's go ahead now and do that. So let's build a new function. So this function is going to be called getTotal. And essentially what we're doing here is we're turning the number, in this case 10, into a format that's more suitable for currency. So in the UK we have pounds and pence, so we want, in this case, £10.00 pence. So let's just change that to total. So we do that, or we can describe this as fractional parts. Essentially, we're using a float instead of an integer. I guess we could look at it that way too. So we'll turn this into a function, and then let's go ahead and now return from this function the new currency format. So we're going to take in the total, and now we're going to utilize toLocalString. So this is a method, toLocalString. This is a method which will return a string with a language sensitive representation of the number. So let's go ahead and follow the practice, so undefined. And then we now need to define the actual structure of our total. So we want to use 2 decimal points. So we want £10.00 to represent, in this case, pence. So we can do that easily by adding 2 parameters here. So we need to define the minimum fraction digit. I think it's this one here. Okay, so the minimum integer, no, that's not right. Might as well just type it in. Fraction digits. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to define 2 digits. And then I also want to define the maximum. So the minimum and the maximum. So that's going to also be 2. So I'm always going to display 2 digits or 2 decimal points. So we're going to need a comma here. Okay, so now we've got that in place. We've called this getTotal. Now we've taken in total. So let's go ahead and now call this. So instead of now calling where we had before the total, we're now going to call the function. Okay, so let's go back to our page. So you can now see by default we have the right setup for our currency. So if I add a new item, we now have £10. So this is a function which is quite usable potentially throughout the rest of your application. So having it within the export here, this makes it available only really within this piece of code. So what we can do is we can move this out of our export, and potentially we could import this in, but if we place it up here, we could have this, like I said, imported in, but now this is outside of our export here. So it becomes a reusable piece of code potentially that we can utilize in this. And also, like I said, we can import this in. So what we can do now is we need to pass in total. So that gets passed in through in actual fact down here. So we need to pass in the total because the function cannot read the total from a state by just using total like we did before. Because remember, this function was inside of our export and we'd already declared our state total. So that's why we could utilize it. But now we're going to pass in our total. So we pass in the total here to here, the function runs and then returns the data. So that should look exactly the same. So if I add, and there we go. So this is the end of part 2. So now we've learned how to manage our state in terms of adding and removing items. And we've learned a little bit about fractional digits and how to configure those, and the idea of functions within the export and outside of the export so that we can reuse this code potentially for further components within our application. So now to progress further, we need to think a little bit more expansive here. So let's go ahead and create some more products. So we're going to create a list of products or an array of products here. So we'll do this up the top. So let's just build an array of products. So I'm going to put products equals, and then obviously an array. And now what we want to do here is set an image. So we'll define an image. We're just going to use some emojis. We need a name of the product. So we've got socks, for example. And then we're going to need a price. Ooh, price. So the price of the socks was 10. So I'll go ahead and add some more products here. So I've added 3 items to my products list here. We've got socks and gloves and a dress. So we've added some items. So now what we need to do is just remove the products, the existing products here. So we're just going to actually loop through those and output them onto the page. So now I've cleaned up this code. We're just left with the class name products. So inside of here, we're going to add the loop so we can loop through an array. So we're going to use mapped to do that. So we start off with the products that we defined up here. And we're going to output these individual items from it. So we map it across to item so that we can then refer to the data and output the individual pieces of data. So for every item that we loop through, we're going to create a new div here. And inside of this, we're going to have class name product div. And inside of that, we're going to have a span, which is going to then show the image or the emoji. So we've got the item image that's going to be displayed. Of course, we need to make sure that we're using the area label with the name. So we're going to use the item name for that. And there we go. So let's save that. Let's go back into our page and see what it looks like. There we go. So we now have all of our products on the page. Now we are going to need the buttons to add and remove. So we'll just add those back on. And then in addition to that, so we can display them in a list across the page, let's just go ahead and in the products, display this as flex. Okay, so let's try that. So you can now see there across the page. So previously, when we added items to our cart, that updated the cart with the total items and cost. But when I pressed add again, well, it wouldn't do anything. It would just continue to be one item. So that doesn't work at the moment. So what we need to do now is work out a way of actually updating the cart based upon all the items that we add to the cart. This is our existing function, which updates the state. So we're just going to remove the total for now. Let's just focus on setting the cart. Now, remember that we're setting just the name. We're just adding the name of the item that we've selected into the cart. And then we're just counting that. Remember, we're using length here just to count the items that are in this array. So let's go ahead now and just remember where the data is coming from, because we need the actual item name to actually put in the state. So where we're going to get that item is, let's remember that we've created this array of items up the top here. We're looping through that down here. So for every time we loop through an individual item using map, we then put that data into item, and then we can output the individual pieces of data that correspond to the individual, so in this case name, because there's a name parameter here in our data. So we can output the price, image, and name if we wanted to as we loop through the data. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to pass this data across to our add function. So we're going to need to type in item here. So that adds the item data about that particular item when we click on the button. So now we want to pass that data over to our function here called add. So this was called item. And now what we want to do is collect the data from the state and then update it. So we want to just add a new item to our state. So again, we use set, in this case, cart. Yeah, so set cart. And now we want to collect the data already exists and then basically just update it with new data. So let's do that. So current, and then in this case we've got item, so we get the data from the item that we passed in, and it's just the name that we want to use. Okay, so that's going to update our cart with the new item name and make a new entry into our array. So let's have a look to see if that actually works. So if I press add, adds one item, 2 items, 3 items, 4 items, and so on. Obviously, behind the scenes, like I said, this isn't an integer. We're just trying to go back here. What we're doing here is we're getting the length of the array, and we're just displaying as an integer the length of the array, so the amount of items that we're storing in our cart. So let's just show you that if I remove length and just refer to cart, let's just go back in and see what that looks like. Socks, 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 gloves, dress, and so on. So you can see it's saving in the array all the names of the items, but like I said, we're just counting the amount of items that are in the array. So let's just move that back to length, the cart length. Okay, so now let's deal with the total. So we're going to use here set total because we want to update our state. And now what we need to do is similar type of function here. We want to get the current information, and then we basically just want to add it to the new price. Simple as that. So in this case, current, and then we want to say current, so the data that's currently there, and then we want to basically just add it to the item, price, because that's the where we're storing the data in price. Okay, so let's have a look at that, see if that is working. So now when we press add, we've got the total cost. Now the socks were £10, so you can see it goes up in tens. The dress I think was £50, so 170. So you can see it's clearly working. Okay, so that's part 3 completed. We now have the ability to loop out. This data could come, for example, from a database. We can loop out the data. We've added our new add functionality so that we can update the state with new data. So far, we've used useState. Now, this isn't necessarily the best function to use for updating the state. And in actual fact, there's another hook called useReducer that is specifically designed to update the state based upon the current state. So let's have a look at utilizing this. So first of all, we need to just import this in. So use, you can see all the different use we have available here: state, reducer, memo, effect, and so on. So these are all different hooks that we could potentially utilize. So let's bring in the useReducer. Now I don't know why that's happened. So let's use this. Okay, so let's bring this in, and now let's see how we can integrate it and refactor our code here to utilize it within our system. So what we need to do is take the, for example, cart here. So instead of useState, we're going to use the reducer, and then we're now going to name it. So cart reducer. So we're going to build a function for this. So useReducer, and then we're going to now build a function to perform actions. So let's do this. Zoom out a bit here. Let's do this outside of the export. So now we need to add a new function. So let's build a new function. It's going to be called cart reducer. So we're taking two items. We're going to take in the state, the current state, and the item. So the current data in the state, and then the item. So we're going to pass in the item that we selected. So when we press add, that's going to be the data that we're going to pass in. So now we want to obviously return the state data and then add in the item that we've selected in our shopping page. So that happens. So we've created an action for when we now add an item, and that's going to then perform the action of adding the new item to our state. So what we need to do now is remove this item here. We don't need all this piece of code here because we don't want to perform our action in that way anymore. And this simplifies it in that all we need to do now is set the item, and in this case the name. So we're just going to pass in the item and the name. So now when we call the add here, or the set cart, sorry, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the product name instead of passing in what we had before, which was the function. So that's how we're going to set the cart. So we're going to call the reducer function. So you can see here we're going to call the reducer function, and that's obviously going to take in the second item here and add the item to the state. So we can do the same thing again with the total. But let's just have a look at this in action to see if this works. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So that's definitely working. So let's do the same thing for the total. So let's just copy this. So cart is going to be cart total, and obviously we're just taking in an integer here. So set total equals useReducer cart total, and let's now make a new function. So we'll just copy this function down. This is going to be called cart total. Okay, so let's just change that to total reducer. So we'll call this total reducer, and then the same process again, take in the state, and this time the item, and then we're going to return, in this case, it's just going to be state plus the item price. There we go. So let's go ahead and try this. So we've got nan, nan, and nan. So you can see that that is not working. I surprised myself then, but obviously we've not changed the function down here, have we? So now obviously we just need to remove this and item.price. So we obviously only want to pass the price across now. So we've still got nan. Okay, so let's see what the problem is here. So you can see what we've done. We've just followed the same principles as before. So what could be the problem here? So this can be a common mistake. So here, for example, remember we're collecting the item from item, and we're collecting the individual piece of item price. So when we move it across, sometimes we forget that we've actually moved across the actual price here and the actual name. So we've extracted the name, we've selected the name, sorry, and that's what we have here. So we don't need to move into item again when we move up here. So like we did with the first item here, we just took the name. So we're just passing over the name. So here we don't need to then go into item and the price again because we've already extracted the price. So let's just, we can name this differently. So for example, we can now just say price and then take the data and then add it to the original state here. So now we've got that in place. Let's go back and just add this up. So you can see it is now working. So you may have been thinking, well, why use a function here? We've added more lines of code, whereas before when we were using useState, we only had a line of code here to update data, but now we're using a whole function here. So we seem to be adding more code. So it doesn't necessarily look like it's the best way to go here. So utilizing this function here, we can perform different actions based upon the user's input. So we need to configure not only add, but now obviously remove items. So in this process, we need to be able to identify the item that needs to be removed. And then based upon the values of the item, we need to subtract that, for example, the price from the price, the current price. And obviously we then need to move or remove the name from the state, from the cart also. So let's see how we're going to configure that. So I've removed all the items in the function add. So let's just go ahead now and do this. So what we're going to do first is we're going to take in the item details like we did before. And now what we're going to do is we're going to set an object. So item as an object with two parameters, name and price. So we're just going to extract the name and the price essentially out of the item that we've clicked on. And then we're going to set this object inside of item. So now what we can do is we can use that data. So we're going to set cart to the name. So instead of using item.name, we've just basically, we're doing exactly the same thing here, but we're just utilizing name here from the object we've created. And now we want to set the total. So we want to use the price. Now this set total now is going to be an object with two items. So the first item is going to be the price of the item. And then secondly, we're going to add some more data called type. And then we're going to say add. So we're going to use this data here to perform an action or to define a choice in the function. So now we've got this data in place. Let's move back over to our function, our total reducer function here. So we've got the state and we've got the price. Okay, so obviously what we're doing now is we are going to change the price again. So based upon whether someone has clicked the add button or not, depends on what we actually perform. So what we can do now is create an if statement. So if, for example, the price dot type is equal to add. So basically what I'm saying here is if I've clicked on, if I've clicked on add, the button, that's going to take me to the add function up here. So the add function. So if I then set the total, I've obviously sent across this object here, so I can check to see if the type is add. So what I've done here is I've taken in the price. I said if it's dot type equals add, which it does. So I'm just checking this field here for add. So if it does equal add, then I'm going to perform a task. So I'm going to return the state, the original state, plus in this case, the price. Inside the price, we have the price, don't we? So we've sent it across here, the price. So I need to actually go into the data. So we passed it across as price. This is probably not the best word to use in actual fact. So let's just turn this into an action. So we're going to pass the data over as action now. So all the data is going to be returned as action. So inside of that is the data that we've placed here, for example. So there we go. So if the action type equals add, we're now just going to return the state plus action price. So let's go ahead and see if this is going to work. So let's go back. So add, add, add. So you can see that the price is still adding. We haven't set up the remove button yet, but you can see that it's clearly working. If I were to change this to something random, obviously this isn't going to equal add anymore. So this shouldn't work. So the total shouldn't update. So if I press add, you can see we get an error. So that shows it's clearly utilizing this piece of code here to perform this if statement here. So let's just handle the remove. Let's just create a new function, or you may have already have the existing function, remove. So let's go ahead and remove the data. So what we need to do is go ahead and utilize set total again. So we're going to use set total. Now we want to pass in the item, of course. Oh, I spelled function wrong. So we're going to take in the item again when we press the remove button. So we take the item data in, and we can go ahead and, like we've done up here, we just set up the data so we can utilize it. So we're only going to need, in this case, the price. Now, in this case, we're now going to say delete. So that we're going to perform the delete function. So you can still see that we're calling the same function here, set total. So here we're still using total reducer. So we're still using this function. So we've got the if action for add. Now we can add the if action for delete. But of course, we don't actually need to do that. We can just add a return if this statement isn't true. So if it isn't add, then it must be this statement here, which is going to be false. So this is going to be state, take away the action price. So now we just need to go back down to the button here. We're just going to copy this function across to the remove. So this time we're not using the add, we're using remove. So let's go into our program again. So add and then remove. So you can see that the total cost has been removed. So if I add 20, or now it says minus 20, so we need to deal with that potentially. So add 20 and then minus 20. So you can see it's removing and adding the corresponding total costs based upon the products. So now we come to the most complicated stage. So that was stage 4. So you'll find all the code here in the stage 4 zip. Now, like I said, it's the most complicated stage, because let's just think about what we need to do now. We need to be able to add items, of course, we can do that. And we know how to remove the costs, but we need to also now remove, if you remember inside of here, we have the name of the item. So let's just go back into here. Let's just remove a length again. If you remember, we have the actual name of the item being saved. So socks, gloves, and dress, and so on. And this is an array. So when we remove an item, not only, well, the easy bit was obviously to remove the cost, because that's just a number. But when we remove the dress from here, we need to be able to actually select the dress from this array. And this might be, for example, the gloves is in the middle here. So we need to find a way of actually splicing this up so that we can select the individual item and remove it from the array. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky potentially. Also, we need to potentially work out a way of avoiding this minus figure here. So like we said, the total cost, that's pretty simple to manage. So now we're in the cart reducer here. So this is where the products get saved. So now we need to update this. So we'll use action again to make it easier for you to understand. We're going to be performing an action. So let's get rid of this return. Now there's a few different actions that we might want to take. So we can use if-else statements and so on, but it can be sometimes easier to use a switch. So here we can perform different actions based upon different cases. So here we're going to have action type. Oh, get the right letters, type. So we're going to set up some actions or some cases. So if we have a case of add, then obviously we're just going to add this to the array. So this is just going to return, for example, what we had earlier, which was the state and the action in this case, because now we're referring to the item as action, remember? So action dot, and then it was just the name. So that should add and return the name. So typically when we utilize switches, we normally also add a default. So let's go ahead and add the default. So the default is just to return the state. I tell you what, for someone who types, 8-9 hours a day, when you've got a microphone in front of you, for some reason, I find that I can't type properly. How many mistakes I make when I type out. So now we've got that in place. Let's have a look here and then go back and refresh. So we've got add, and you can see that the total items isn't actually working. So the reason why that isn't working, if you remember what we did with the total reducer, we had to actually define, in this case, this object with this item here, with add. So obviously we need to do the same thing with the costs, right? So let's do that. So now we've got the total. So we need to do the same thing again here. So with the set cart, that's the name. So we need to now create a new object with name. So we pass in the name and also then the type, and that's going to be add again. So that just obviously matches now the case. So the case of add, then we're going to obviously update. So let's just see if this is working. So when we add now, you can see that we're adding the name at the moment because we didn't change back. If we go back, if I zoom out, sorry, where is it? So the reason why we're outputting the name is because we didn't update the cart here. So we want the length, remember, of the array. So we get the number. So now when we press add, you can now see it's working as before. Okay, so add works and the total cost works. Obviously the cost also works here for reducing items. So now we need to work out a way of removing the items from the total items. So now we need to configure our cart reducer for the remove. So move up to line 27 with the function for cart reducer. And now I've added a new case here called remove. So the first thing I need to do is add all the data from the state into this new variable called update. So I do that because what I want to do is I want to inspect all the data and remove specific data. So let's remember that when we press this button here, add, that adds a new item to an array. And inside of that array, it will say socks. Now, obviously, we're using length here to see how many items are in that array, and that's why we get a 1. But what we want to do is we want to inspect that array and then look for an item or look for socks in that array and then remove it. And obviously that's the same for gloves and dress. So if we find that word dress in the array, we're going to remove it from the array. So first of all, we get all the data from the state and we put it into this new variable called update. So now what we want to do is to get this data update, we want to splice it. So this is going to allow us to splice the data. So if you're not too familiar with a splice, have a little read here. So the splice method changes the content of an array by removing or replacing existing elements and or adding new elements. So obviously we want to remove an element from the array. So this is why we're using splice. So now all we need to do is select the item that we want to update. So index of, and now we need to select the actual item. So that is from action. So remember we're taking in the action, that's the item that we've selected. So we want to obviously just remove the name because that's what we're storing in this array. If you remember, we're just storing the name and how many items we want to remove. And there we go. Okay, so that should now find the item in the array and then remove one instance of it. And once we've done that, obviously we need to return that. So we need to return the update. And there we go. Okay, so that should now remove the item. So let's give that a go. So back in our browser, let's add one item, remove. It doesn't work. Okay, so why doesn't this work? Well, let's remember we've not actually hooked up the remove button for this. So let's remember we're using remove case here. So we haven't actually defined a remove case yet. So move into the remove function. So we've set the total. We've set the remove for the total, but now we need to do the same for the cart, right? So let's do exactly that. So set, in this case, the cart. And now we want not the price, but it's the name. That's what we send across, and type delete. So let's just go ahead and make sure we've got the remove button in place. So we've got on-click remove, and then we pass in the item. Yep, so let's go ahead now and have a look to see if this works. So there is still one problem, and that is because I removed this from the code earlier. So if you remember, we passed in the price for the price, and I removed the name. So from item, we also want to collect the name so that we can utilize it here. So let's go back now. We'll add some socks. We've added one item. We remove some socks, and it still doesn't work. What could possibly be the problem now? So if you remember, we used delete here. So type equals delete. So we know that this is working. So what error did we receive? We didn't receive an error, which isn't helpful. So let's go back into the code. So if you go back into your switch, you'll find that in actual fact, we use remove and not delete. So let's use delete. And now that matches the case to this case here, to the type here, sorry. So now we should maybe be able to do this. So add one item, £10, remove no items, and the cost is also removed. So it looks like this is working. So let's add 10 and the gloves, which I think is 20. So now then, let's just see if this works. So if I remove the socks, that should be 1 and 20. And there we go. So the last task that we need to perform here is we don't want our calculator or our total costs to go below 0. So we just need to add a new piece of code or refactor our code so that we can prevent this from happening. So hopefully at this point you've got a better idea of exactly what's going on now. And by having these two items to begin with, these two stores, it just allowed us to work a little bit more in a more friendly way because we could concentrate on different items. But I think the reality of this is that we don't need two stores to save this data here in state or to manage our state. We can just save the whole product into one state and work from there. So let's just go ahead and actually do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove one of these states, and we're just going to put everything into this one state. So now what we can do is just refactor the rest of the code here. So for example, our function add item. So all we need to do is have one set cart now. That's pretty much all that we need. Now, because we're just moving all the data across here, it does mean also we don't need this anymore. We can just literally just send all the data across. So this is going to be item and then add. And then we can do the same thing here with the remove. So we've got set cart again. So let's remove that, and we're going to pass in our item details and delete. So now we're going to need to be able to manage these functions in the cart reducer. So let's go over to our cart reducer and update the cart reducer. So we're not going to need the function total reducer anymore. So let's get rid of that because we're just using the one function, which is the cart reducer. So inside of the cart reducer, if you remember, when we added an item or when we added a product, we added the name to the state. Now we don't obviously want to do that because in the state now we're storing all the data about the item. So down here, for example, if we have a look at when we set the cart, we pass over all the data about the item. So that's how we're going to need to identify or refer to it. So let's go into the cart reducer. Instead of name now, storing the name, we want to store the whole item or all the data about the item, which is the object about the item. Also, it's an object which stores the data about the item. So let's go back now and have a look at this on the page. Now this still might not work. We just need to remove this item for now, the total cost, because we need to recalculate that. So let's go back onto the page. We'll refresh, we'll add. You see this still works, 1 and 0, so it's still calculating how many is in the array, which is good. But what we can also do is check to see what data is actually being stored. So let's just, for example here, just do a console log. So let's just log the data that's currently inside the cart. That's obviously the state data cart. So when we go back now, we'll just use this console here. So when I press add, you can see that we've got some new data appearing here, and we've added some data to the state, and this is the data that's being returned from the state. So if I add some more, you can clearly see that more data is being added and so on. So that just gives a clear indication that the data is being stored correctly in the state. So the reason why I'm showing you this is because you see that when we add new data, there's an index number here, 0, 1, and when we add some more data, we now have 0, 1, and 2, and so on. So whereas before we selected from the state and we sliced from the state, if you remember the name, and removed the name from the array, this time we need to now remove the whole object from the array. Because remember, now we're not just storing the name, we're storing all the data about the item. So we need to be able to remove all the data about the item from the array here. So we can do that by utilizing this index number here. So number 2, 1, and 0, etc. And that also creates a much cleaner way of removing individual items from the state. Now that our data, or all the data, is being stored in the state, every time we add a piece of data, notice that there's an index number here, 0, 1. If I add some more data, then becomes 0, 1, and 2, and so on. So we can utilize this index here to remove items from the state. And obviously, if we select from the index here, so if I say I want to delete everything from index number 1, that's obviously going to delete everything here. Whereas before we were just deleting the individual names that were stored in the state. So let's go ahead and update our cart reducer, the delete case. Now this is going to happen in three parts. So first of all, we need to select the item that we want to remove. Then we need to check to see if we have actually returned an item, because if we haven't returned an item, then we just want to go back to the application. We don't want anything to happen. Then if we do find an item, then of course we want to then update. In this case, the update will be to delete that particular item from the state. So we're going to update this here. So let's change this. So state dot, we're going to try and find the index. Now we need to do that we need to find the index of the item that we selected. So we're going to try and use, for example, the item name. Now that is going to equal, in this case, we're sending all the data into this function through action. So this is going to be action. And then inside of action is the item. And then we want to select the name of the item. Okay, so we're going to try and use the name to get the index number. So once we've done that, we can then go ahead and check just to see if we did actually return anything. So if, for example, the update is less than 0, because remember the first item in our list will be 0. We start from 0. And then we're going to just return the state. That's pretty much all we need to do. And then that exits. So in addition to that, we now want to change our update. So we can remove this. So we want to now update. So let's go ahead and store update equals, let's get the state data. So we're using an array. So let's get the state data. And now we want to update it. So we've obviously collected the index key. So we're going to need that. So we'll say update.splice. And then we want to update so we put the data in the variable, the index in the variable update. So let's use update here, and we just want to delete one item. So we just delete one of the items, and there we go. So we got that. We return update. That should then update the state. So now we have add item and delete item. So I guess what we can do now is maybe test this. So let's go ahead and do that. Now I'm just wondering if that's been connected. So remove on click, we're going to remove and then item. So we probably need to change maybe that. Add, remove. No, that's okay. So add, move, item. So set cart. No, that's okay. Right, so let's go ahead and have a look, see if we've got any problems. We do. We've got this problem here. Identify update has already been declared. Okay. So the problem is here is that we've already declared update here. So let's just go ahead and change that to something else. So item key. So let's change that to item key if item key is less than 0. So we'll keep that there. And then we've now got update. So we're now moving that across there. The item key goes into there, and that then updates and returns the update. Okay, so let's go back into our page. Let's add some items, remove some items. So it looks like we can still do that. So obviously we now need to configure the cost again. So this is going to be slightly different because what we want to do is we want to perform the action and then display the data in this case. So we're going to output to the screen the information from getCart. So let's go back into our cost here. So this is going to be get total again, and then whatever's in our cart. So that will go into there. Now let's just remove that, and then let's just add end bracket there. So let's just update that. So the total cost is going to be from the function get total. So now we need to just change the function here slightly. So let's go ahead. We're going to add a new line here. So at the moment, we're not actually storing the cost anymore. So whereas before we were actually recording, if you remember, we had two states, one for the items and one for the cost. So we're not actually storing the final cost anymore. So how are we going to actually work out how much, how are we actually going to work out the total amount in the cart? So what we're going to do is, if you remember, we're storing all the data about every item that the user has selected in an array. So what we need to do is move through that array step by step, item by item, and just calculate the total from all the items that are in the basket or in the array in this case. So we're going to use reduce to do that, and that's going to loop through every item in the array and just add up. So let's create a new function for this. So this, we're going to output the number or the total cost of all items in the array that the user has selected into total. So let's go ahead and we need to get the cart data. So we need to pass in the cart data from the state. So that's what we're doing here. And that's all the data, remember, that's stored in the state. So we have cart, and then we use reduce. So that's going to kind of loop through all the data in the array. So what we need to do now is define the total cost of the items, and that's basically going to be total cost. So basically what's happening here is that every time we add some data from the price, we're just going to put it into the total cost, and that's going to keep a tally of all the cost of based upon all the additions of all the items that are in the array. So let me just write this all out and I'll explain that again. So the item dot price. So here basically what we're doing is we're reducing something. So we're going through the array, all the items that are in the array, we're going to calculate the costs of all the items that are in the array. So we basically set two parameters here. This is the running total. So when we add each item, this is going to be the running total. And this is basically the item. So for each item, we just refer to it as item. So what we're doing here, you can see that we basically get the running total plus the item. So for every item we loop through in the array, we're basically going to check the price of the item only. That's the only field that we're going to check. Remember the price. And then we're basically just going to add it to the total cost every time we loop through every item in the array. Okay, so that will then output the total of all the prices in the array. So now we can utilize that to perform further actions in our application. So you can see that we're just utilizing the code before. We're just returning now the total, and then we're just formatting it into our fraction digits as per normal. Okay, so let's go back in because we've obviously passed in cart here. Let's just double check. Yep, so we're passing cart to it, the cart data. So we're getting cart from the state. We're passing it into get total so it can be utilized, because remember this is outside the export here, this function up here. So that should be that in place. So I wonder if now we can have a look. I wouldn't have thought so just yet. We've still got a problem. Reduce of empty array with no initial value. Okay, so if we don't define an initial value in the reduce here, when we in our reduce here, it's going to cause a problem. So what we need to do after price is actually define a default value. So I've defined this default value, and you can now see it's working okay. So let's just add. You can see that it's now adding. Will it remove? It also removes. So it looks like it's okay. And notice also when I try and remove more, well, nothing is getting returned. So here, for example, remember that we're only removing items. So we try and find the key of the item. If the item key is less than 0, and it will be if we don't select an item, then we just return the state. We don't actually do anything. So you can see that's exactly what's happening now. We just remove, and every time we try and remove now, obviously it's not removing anything. So we're not actually making any calculations. Remember, we're not making any calculations because we're now calculating based upon the cart, what's actually inside of the state. Okay, so I think that is just about it there. I think we've completed it. So overall, you now have an overview on how to create data in a state utilizing hooks, and also how to update data. This tutorial really features some of the really core features and functionality that you'll be using a lot of the time, because everything is stored in arrays, or a lot of things are stored in arrays. You need to be able to manage arrays and get used to managing data in an array. Hence we use, for example, splice here to perform those types of actions. So definitely have a look at now trying to expand upon this. Maybe you can attach this to a database, for example. Obviously, this could be utilized as part of an API system that you might be utilizing. So have a go, see if you can think about some other features you might want to include, and see if you can now include it, add some more data to this, explore and experiment, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.